back to another Ableton tutorial. Lovely to have you here. Big shout out to Patreon crew. Patreon members will of course be able to download this entire set from today's explorations. Big shout out to YouTube crew. Lovely to have you here. Lovely to see this little community growing. Right, let's dive in today. Let's dive in. You can hear three things happening in the background. You can hear sort of little glitchy loop there. That was from a recent tutorial I made about making glitchy loops from scratching old records. I'll put a link to that down below if you want to watch the tutorial or even download the pack that's available over on Patreon, but also as a one-time purchase. That was an ad. You could also hear this sort of Ableton stock drum beat. I didn't really do much to that, just dragged it in. Those things are not what we're looking at today. What you can hear here is what we're looking at today. I'm going to look at some stuff using Ableton's Impulse and using Ableton's Impulse using one sample and how to create endless complex loops. These are some of the presets that I made. Endless presets, endless complex loops. Let's delete that. And let's start from the start. So I said we're going to use Ableton's Impulse and we're going to use one sample. So let's go to Instruments. Let's drag in Impulse. So Impulse is one of the things that has been around in Ableton kind of the longest. And so maybe we kind of overlook it because we're like, oh, what's new? Well, what's new is we're going to explore that today. And so Ableton's Impulse is a sample playback device. So we can load 8 different samples in here, and at this point you're thinking, well, that's kind of probably a lot like a drum rack, isn't it? Or even sort of a simpler. Yes, but there's some cool stuff we can do with velocity information built into Impulse that we can't do with simpler. So sometimes the way that a thing is put together lets us explore different creative possibilities. And of course, there are workarounds to do what I'm going to do today if you wanted to do this in simpler. But I like that it's all built in here and it's going to be quite fun to explore. So I mentioned we're going to use Impulse. I mentioned we're going to use one sample. So I'm going to go to samples here and I made some multi-samples of playing harmonics on a mandolin. This whole sample pack and the instruments I made from it are also available on Patreon. That was another ad. No more ads today, I promise. No more ads. So we now have one sample just dragged into Impulse, and let's take a look at a little bit about how Impulse works and how we're going to set things up today. And I'm going to use Ableton's Melodic Steps for this as well. Now, I made another video about Melodic Steps, so I'm not going to dive too deep into what's happening, but let's dive in a little bit about how we're going to use this within the context of Impulse. So first things first, we need to figure out what notes are being outputted here so we can connect it with Impulse, because Impulse functions in that this first sample is C3. So let's bring in a MIDI monitor and let's slide that in on there. Right, and we can see that it is outputting C1 at this point now. So either we need to bump the octaves up by 2 octaves in here, or we can change it here. So I'm just going to change it here. So let's put this up to, there we go, C3, and it's now outputting this sample. Now we can see that the chants here on Melodic Steps, I'm not going to explore that so much right now, so let's put the chants up so it's always triggering. Okay, let's turn that down a bit because that's going to get quite intense quite quickly. Okay, so let's look at what's happening. So we have these octaves being triggered. We probably don't want that. We just want that to stay on C. Yeah, exactly. So using transpose here is not going to change the pitch of the sample. This is going to change which sample is being played back. So if I make this down to 2 steps and now I move this up, we can see now that the samples being played back are over here. So transpose is how we're going to change which sample is being triggered, which slot here is being triggered. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that same sample into 4 slots. I think we're only going to use 4 slots for this. Let's drag you over here. Let's drag you over here. And let's drag you over here. So we now have the same sample in 4 different slots. So if I was to change this, now we can see different samples being triggered. Okay, so let's look at some of the things that we could do with these samples. We can transpose it. Oh, let's go back to sample 1, please. I just jumped ahead of myself there. And we can see that as I was pressing transpose or moving transpose here, the sound was not changing. That's because all of these parameters, in fact, all the way up to here, I think, all the way up to here, are individual for each sample, which is really nice. So we can transpose the sample, we can stretch it, make it longer, make it shorter. We've got decay settings here, pan settings, and individual volume settings for each sample. So, we can also control many of these. Of course, there's a saturation and a filter in here that we can also control per sample as well. Saturation actually sounds quite nice. Okay, so we can control these parameters also using velocity. So at the moment, we've just got a constant velocity, but let's change this velocity loop down to 2 measures long as well. In fact, let's change them all down to 2 measures for now. That's going to be simpler. 2 is the lowest that this will go. So now if I make 2 different velocities. Now we can hear that being reflected in the sort of volume of the output sound. And that is, of course, one of the main ways that we use MIDI velocity information is to control the output volume of a synthesizer. Makes sense, velocity, volume, kind of, yeah. Okay, but we can also use velocity to control the amount of transpose. So if I increase the percentage here, we can hear it's like almost doing Jaws. We can also use velocity information to control the amount of stretch. And we can also use velocity information, of course, to control the filter. So if we bring the filter down. So now we can hear the velocity controlling a filter, and we can add some randomization to the pitch if we wanted to as well. That's kind of cool. Oh, the stretch has two modes as well, which are quite nice. And we also have this sort of global stretch happening over here. So kind of just want to focus on what we can do with velocity information and the transpose on this now. So now let's now make a 4-note pattern. So we know that it might get a little bit confusing because there's transpose here and transpose here. So for the rest, but this transpose is not changing the pitch. This transpose is just for the pattern. So I'm gonna, where it says transpose, I'm gonna say pattern for the rest of this. So we now have a 4-note pattern. I changed the pattern here to 4 notes, and I'm just gonna program it in so it sort of plays through the samples in order. We're going up too high at the end. What's going on? We're now not getting the middle one. Too high at the end. Okay. So now we have, this 4-note pattern playing through the samples. So now if I change the pitch of the second sample, it's only going to... And let's change the velocity back to constant here, please. Yeah. Now maybe it's nice to transpose this up. This is nice. So now I can control, I have this nice pattern going. If I put this all the way up here and change the pattern length to 5, we can see that it's being triggered here, but there's no sample there. So we're now sort of getting these gaps in the pattern, which is really nice. Now let's make this velocity a 4-step sequence as well. And let's make it something more like... Lovely. Now, if I control also the velocity to pitch thing here, so I've clicked on the first sample. That's not on the first note. Let's resync this. So we now hear that only the first note is being affected by this velocity information. And of course, this is nice for creating different patterns like this. We can use it quite linearly. But if I now change this velocity pattern to 5 beats long, so this velocity information is only affecting the pitch of the first note here. The rest are on 0. Velocity 0, velocity 0, velocity to pitch 0, velocity to pitch 43%. It's having some quite interesting effects. And so this is what I'm going to play with a bit today. So I have this, we can sort of contract that now. We don't need the MIDI monitor anymore. So we have this velocity information coming in. Maybe it's nice to use this velocity information to control something else. So I'm going to use that to control, let's how are we going to extract that? We're going to extract that using the expression control. So usually when I've reached for the expression control in these videos, I've just gone for random because I like random things. But here we have this lovely pattern from the velocity control, and the expression control reads incoming MIDI information, velocity. So we're going to map that velocity to something, and I'm going to map it to sort of a reverb send that I'm going to set up inside the channel, because I want to sort of make this a whole rack that I can drag into different projects, and we can't save reverb sends and funky reverb stuff inside racks. So I'm going to set up a send inside the rack using an effects chain. So let's bring in a utility. So I'm going to use, let's contract you for now. I'm going to use this velocity information to control the utility. So this is going to be sort of effectively the send, but I'm going to reverse it. So I think what would be nice is if the less velocity, therefore the quieter the notes are, the more it's getting sent to a reverb. So I'm going to set this to unipolar, and I'm going to set this to -50. And I'm just now going to connect that to the rate. Yeah, so now the quieter the notes, the more that's coming through. So now let's bring a reverb in. And because I'm setting this up as a reverb send, I want the dry wet up to 100%. This is quite a nice effect. Let's group this. Open up this and let's create a dry chain. That's quite nice. Let's actually increase this a bit. That's nice. I'm liking this. Nice. Of course, we can use this velocity information to control something else. Let's just mute that reverb chain. Let's maybe, I mean, even on the dry chain, we could do something like bring in a ring modulator. So let's bring in the shifter, change it to ring modulation. That's fun. Let's just change this to velocity again. Velocity. That's kind of fun. What happens if that was also connected to the dry wet? Velocity, where have you gone? Velocity. That's kind of a fun effect. I like that. Let's delete that for now. Of course, you can add sort of any effects that you want on there. You're adults. You can make your own decisions. Okay, so now what I want to do is map a bunch of these parameters to things so I can change them easily. Now, the reason I want to do this is a couple of people have asked me in the comments, actually, how do I go about turning ideas like what we explore in this channel into songs? How do I go about that? So the way that I like to do that is to create sort of performable instruments that have things I can change that are at my fingertips, and then kind of jam with them and explore what I find interesting about them. So some of the things that I find interesting about this, I want to map to macros. So what are the things that I find interesting about this? So I was finding it really interesting when I was sort of changing the length of these patterns. That was really interesting. And then, of course, this pattern as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bang this up to and just make an interesting pattern here. That's nice. So this to me is a really interesting thing to play with. In fact, let's bring in those drums in the background so we can hear that happening against a beat. So I find this really interesting, this interplay between the very straight 4/4 rhythm of the drums and now, however you want to count this, anything's in 4 if you count hard enough. But these two things that are not linearly combined, they're not resetting at the start of each bar. I find this really interesting. So these are things that I want to make performable. So I'm going to right-click on this. First of all, I want to actually group all of this, of course. Select everything, Command-G. We're going to group all of that. So now I can right-click on this, map to macro 1. And I'm going to actually open up all the macros. And I'm going to rename that because that's now transpose length. But that's actually the length of our pattern, not the transposition. So I'm going to call that pattern length. And this was really interesting. The velocity, which of course is kind of connected to our pitch pattern. So I'm going to, but let's call that pitch length. I spelled that wrong. That's going to annoy me if I don't fix it. Sorry. Okay. Right. What are some other things that are going to be interesting to play with in a sort of performative setting about this? Well, I also like the idea of sort of being able to bring in a human element to this. So I'm going to make a sort of randomizer timing and velocity thing in here. So to randomize the timing, because this is all very straight, it's very rigid. So I'm going to bring in a MIDI effect. I'm going to bring in the note echo, and I'm going to put this after the Melodic Steps device. Oh, I want the feedback down to 1, and I want no through signal coming through, and I want to change the sync to off, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this milliseconds offset here to randomize some timing. So I'm going to bring in an expression control here. So what we've done here is we've got an incoming MIDI signal. We've said turn the incoming MIDI signal off and hold it inside the note echo. We only want one echo, so that means it's only going to generate one signal coming out. And I can offset that using this device here. So now I am going to set this to random. And I'm going to connect that with this here. So now we get, wow, that's fun. That's kind of like a super randomy thing. Let's make it so maybe it doesn't go quite so intense. And it's going to be really interesting to control the amount of that. So I'm going to right click here, because if I go from 0 to 50 here, that's going to control the amount of randomness. Right click, map to, well, first of all, I'm actually going to make this into a rack. So I'm going to select that, Command G, and I'm actually going to connect that to macro 1 inside this rack. And let's timing random. And let's do the same thing with a velocity inside here as well. So I can now velocity random stuff. So let's bring in a velocity plugin. Now what I want to do is connect 3 things to one macro here. I want to connect output high to macro 2. I want to connect output low to macro 2, and I want to connect random. Oh, we're getting some nice clipping there. Let's turn you down. Okay, so what I want is that when we're all the way down here, I want it to be this straight linear curve across here. So let's open the mapping settings across here. Okay, so random, yes, should be set to 0 when it's all the way down. The max velocity, the output high here should be 127. There we go. That's exactly right. And now when I move this all the way up, I want the output with this one. I think the output low, what do I want? Yes, this should be 64. No, output low should be 64 here. And this should also be 64. No, not that one. This should be 64. Yeah, okay. So now when I go all the way down here, we get a straight curve with no randomization all the way up here, full randomization on the velocity, right. So now I have this kind of Humaniser plugin. Timing randomizer and a velocity randomizer. Okay, so let's minimize all of those. We only need 2. We need both of you. And we don't even need to see that anymore. Now I have like my thing here. Okay, so now I'm going to connect this to a macro 3. Oh wait, this is now going, I need to change that range as well. This needs to be 0 to 50. That's the modulation amount on the timing randomizer. Yeah, lovely. Okay, so let's connect that to macro 3. Let's connect that to macro 4. Now, I'm going to want to do a little bit of treatment on all of these sounds as well. So let's set that up. Probably want to have actually coming in before this is our verb rack. Before that, let's bring in right after the output of the impulse, let's bring in a limiter. Right, limiter in here. Lovely, that's doing some nice controlling of stuff. And now let's bring in sort of a master volume so I can sort of easily control the output gain of this. Yeah, okay. So now I want to connect that to a macro. I'm going to connect that to macro 8 because I like to use Ableton's push, and it of course has 8 parameters per screen. So let's connect that to macro 8 and let's constrain that range because we don't ever want to go up to plus 35, maybe plus 10 at the most. Lovely. So now I have a master output. Okay. Right, some other things. The reverb length is going to be a nice thing to be able to control. So let's come in here. Because we're inside a rack, I need to map to macro 1 inside this rack, and then right click, map to let's map that to macro 7. Let's rename that verb time. So now I can write from here. Can control the verb time in here. That's really nice. Maybe it's nice to connect the global velocity on impulse. And not global velocity, the global timing. This thing. Yeah. That's going to be a nice thing to add to a macro. Let's add that to macro 5. Okay, now I'm going to connect some things underneath here. I have one spare macro here. Leave that for now. So now I'm going to do things here mainly connected with what we were exploring in impulse. Let's minimize this for now. Mainly to do with these velocity and transpose settings. So actually for each of these four samples, I'm going to right click, map to macro 9 and right click, map to macro 10. And let's do the same thing here. Map to macro 11, map to macro 12. Now let's come in here. Map to macro 13, map to macro 14, and this one map to macro 15 and map to macro 16. So now I can easily control the pitch and sort of how much of velocity pattern is controlling the altering pitch of each of those things right from here. Makes it really nice and easily controllable. Okay, I'm going to save this as a macro variation. So I'm going to hit the macro save thing here. I'm going to save, and let's just call this main. Maybe at this point it's nice to bring this little glitchy thing happening. Nice. So now using these, I can get some really beautifully, continuously evolving patterns, just adjusting the pattern length and the pitch pattern length. This is fun. Nice and easy to control. Okay, let's save that again. That's quite nice where we are now. Now now comes the fun part. So if I hit random here, it's going to randomize all of these parameters here. Now, the one thing that perhaps I don't want to randomize is the output gain. It could get super loud or super quiet really quite quickly. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to select exclude macro from randomization. So now I just hit random here. I mean, this is fun. I think what might be nice to connect to macro 6 is actually just the decay on... Yeah. So this is just the decay of this, and already this gives quite a different pattern. So I'm going to connect that to macro 6. Let's come back here. Yeah. All right, let's save that again. Oh, wow. Okay. This is fun. Let's save that as a new... What are we going to call that? Fun. Oh yeah, okay, so we have these velocity pattern. Let's randomize this velocity pattern. Oh wait, now what happens if we come back here? Yeah. And of course, if we turn off this chance here and we could do all sorts of interesting things there. Let's bring that back down to here though. Let's name this. So what I would now do is go through and make a bunch of presets, which I will do, which will be available for download as part of this project. But now let's take it back to this. So now I have these ways of performing with it. I can go to my Ableton push. Play with these things and then very quickly jump back to this main pattern. So all of these different ways that I can play with things. Patterns falling apart, and so what I like to do is find these things that I find interesting to play with and jam with, play with the macros, and just record myself jamming. And often I will do this with 2 or 3 different instruments. Like I said, I'm going to make a longer tutorial, sort of really just exploring that. What I wanted to explore today was this, endlessly permutating patterns. That you can then develop, jam, play with. Of course, we could do this with any sample. The type of sample you're going to put in is going to make huge change. Would love to hear what you try. Send me links, tag me. Thanks for being here. Enjoy exploring, enjoy musicking, enjoy jamming.